approaching how to measure and evaluate belonging and how belonging matters, it's useful to distinguish the quantitative from qualitative approaches to measurement. As you know, the quantitative approach requires operationalizing a concept, which means turning it into a measurement instrument that can measure how much of the concept exists, like how much belonging there is on some scale. They can be used over time. It can be used for pre and post measurement. But the qualitative approach is not to turn it into a single generalizable scale, but to expect and look at the different meanings, the ways in which people relate to a concept in different ways, and to illuminate those variations. And that's what we're going to do with an example from the Blandin Foundation, which is a foundation in northern Minnesota that supports rural communities in Minnesota. Their scaling out involves having an impact on rural communities throughout Minnesota, helping those communities thrive. Scaling up means moving through the levels from individual transformation into teams and communities, and scaling long means having an impact over time. In Jessie's opening example of her revisiting an initiative she had done 5 years later and finding out that the values of belonging matters were still present and meaningful to people, that's scaling long. What we're going to do is an example of scaling deep, looking at the various meanings and applications of a concept and the ways in which that affects and illuminates what it means to people, and how then to track those variations and manifestations and meaning in the work that the group is doing. Blandin included in their initiatives a community leadership program that involves selecting 25 local community members to go through a week-long session where they learn how to do community indicators, work on communication skills, designing projects and programs, build belonging and teamwork together. And as a part of that, they were especially interested in the issue of relationships and building relationships and how people belong to a team, belong to their community. They had done a strategic plan in which their strategic framework is aimed at supporting vibrant rural communities. And you see the line there of rural passion, of leadership that they're working on. In the middle is giving communities a sense of possibility, building resilience, finding new trajectories. And on the bottom is the notion of supporting committed connections and inclusion, which is a track very close to belonging and belonging matters. So in this strategic framework, as we looked at going deeply into it, the question was, what are the issues you would prioritize for examination more deeply going forward? From your perspective, where does the foundation's knowledge base most need to be deepened and strengthened within the strategic framework? And when we went through a process with the strategic leadership team, they decided to focus on committed connections. The senior leadership team is the president, 2 vice presidents, 3 program directors, and 4 assistant directors and senior administrative staff, a team of 12 people who devoted initially a day a month for 6 months to deep reflective practice around the meaning of committed connections. And you can think about substituting belonging matters or belonging in what we're about to discuss. So the principle they were working on was to nurture committed connections, to be a relationship-based foundation in their work with grantees, with communities. And so what we did was to look at how committed connections builds social capital. Strong connections is an outcome of their work. looked at the importance of relationship-based change through findings from their grant level evaluations, mobilizing their work in generating action on committed connections, and conceptualizing relationship-based interventions. So to get at this, we asked the question, how does being a committed connector inform and affect the Foundation's work in local communities? I had them then bring in each of them an example of what they considered a strong committed connections case, what they considered a weak example of committed connections, and then we engaged in cross-case analysis, looking for patterns and themes about strengths and weaknesses. And then we examined pending program and initiative proposals through the lens of committed connections. So we'll begin with the lessons that they learned. They learned in approaching the principle of nurturing committed connections, what we learned was that where staff were more deeply engaged, connections were stronger and impacts were greater. Another insight learned was that while contributing funds was very important, it wasn't always about the money. There were a number of successful committed connections for which funding was minimal that yielded positive impacts. Key insights that informed their work included committed connections are core to the Foundation's work, so they really deepened their commitment to relationship-based grant making, and that nurturing connections can take many forms. So what we did was, in looking at cases of strong committed connections, weak committed connections, created and began listing an inventory of different kinds of connections. Here's what came up. Connecting people to each other, individually in small groups, connecting people to networks, connecting people to knowledge, connecting people to issues, connecting issues to issues, breaking down silos between issues, connecting people to resources, connecting people to opportunities, connecting people to action, going from talk to action, connecting people to organizations, connecting organizations to each other, connecting people to communities, connecting communities to each other, connecting communities to regions. And I remember very well, after about 3 months of a single day each month together, and we're building this inventory, one of the vice presidents saying, one of the things we have to do is help disconnect people. Sometimes they have to get divorced from bad relationships, from bad connections. And so disconnecting people from ineffective or dysfunctional connections got attention. And we looked at those cases of how that unfolded. Other committed connections insights. Bringing people together doesn't necessarily lead to committed connections. It requires facilitation and engagement, not just having people occupy a space together. Being an effective connector is a prerequisite for the Foundation to be effective at inclusion, diversity, and equity. This was a key insight. Committed connections constitute both process and outcomes, and the two are linked. It often is the case that relationship building, belonging, committed connections is treated as only process. But having people connected is what a healthy community is. It's what a healthy team is. And so the usual distinction between process and outcomes and logic models disappears in a principle, because the principle is both process and outcomes. It's both how you get there and its results. Having people connected then, having them belong, is both a process of engagement, but an end in itself. It's a result. They looked at virtual connections and what that meant. In addition to deep reflection on our external work, they wrote, we also conducted reflective practice on how we could get better at connecting with each other as a senior leadership team in order to share learning and better leverage our work. Our focusing question is, what is shared learning? So in the first 6 months, we really went deep, a day a month, into their relationships with grantees. And as we were winding that down, one of the participants said, we've been talking about external relationships, but we ought to look at our connections to each other. How is that going? And so they looked at and continued the process for another 6 months, a day, a month, looking at the team's connections to each other. We learn that we only know something when we know it together. As a result of this, we commit to regular check-ins at senior leadership team meetings to cross-fertilize connections being made and knowledge being gained. In other words, changing their meetings from just show and tell and telling each other their activities to actually engaging in facilitated analysis of what they're learning. And the facilitation is key. It's part of the reason they had me involved, so that everybody could participate. The president, the vice presidents, instead of having a person in the system like the director or team leader do the facilitation, if you have a dedicated facilitator, or at least you rotate facilitation, then everybody gets to participate. We ask ourselves what we needed to know together and decided we needed to watch for trends and themes emerging in common from our separate spheres and to better capture impacts as they occur. One way to do this was to develop some simple processes for after-action reviews. That is, to examine together, as we had been doing, when they close out a grant or a process or an initiative, that they come together and dive deeply into what they learned from that initiative in the way that we had developed that method during reflective practice. Monitoring these issues together is a core part of strengthening the team's development. This had such high impact that we then took the process of reflective practice to their board. Other staff members were engaged in the reflective practice process, and they brought together grantees who they had long-term relationships with, what they call high dosage, high impact partners, and went through reflective practice with them. And that led to what we've called the mountain of accountability that emerged, where they looked at different kinds of evaluation they were involved in. At the bottom is routine basic data for accountability. This is the quantitative data, surveys they do, audits of their financial resources, community indicators. In the middle is traditional program evaluation. But at the top, heading towards mission, is deep reflective practice, developmental evaluation, meaning looking at how their principles are unfolding, strategic framework evaluation, and focus on systems change, innovation, and complexity. And then looking at accountability for impact as that top-level mission-oriented work flows back down. If you do a search for Mountain of Accountability Blandin Foundation, you'll find a full document that describes this mountain and its use. It came out of this reflective practice. And so this is a way of thinking about taking a concept like belonging and delving deeply into it, to look at the different meanings that belonging matters takes. And we'll spend some additional time in sessions going forward beginning to create an inventory together of the different manifestations, different meanings of belonging matters as we work together.